This presentation will explore the character of Macbeth, the eponymous hero of Shakespeare's play, and we'll be looking at his character particularly in relation to the idea of masculinity and the extent to which Macbeth is the ideal man, and what he reveals to us about the themes of greed and ambition. Before we get on to the character himself, it's important to consider the context of the play. And there are two contexts to consider here, although they are very, very similar and they share lots of similarities. The context in which the play is set is 11th century Scotland. In terms of masculinity, we have the idea, the expectation of masculine dominance and feminine subservience. It is the man who is expected to be in a position of power and control. We have the importance of lineage, the production of a male to continue the family line, particularly important to Macbeth. Notions of masculinity include expectations of courage, loyalty to king and country, strength and power and dominance. And in terms of succeeding to the throne, different to today, there was no automatic familial accession to the throne. It didn't automatically go to the eldest son. It would often go to the most worthy person, and that's important to the play of Macbeth. In terms of Jacobean society, then, the society in which the play is received, and you might talk about a Jacobean audience, again, this is a patriarchal society in which men are expected to be in a position of control. There is also the uncertainty of succession to the throne. This play is set at a time during the early reign of James I, but it comes in the immediate aftermath of the reigns of Henry VIII and the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I. Both of those previous monarchs, there was a distinct lack of certainty about who would succeed to the throne. Firstly, because of Henry VIII's inability to produce a male heir, and then because of Elizabeth I's decision to not marry and therefore herself not to produce an heir to the throne. So it's a time of great uncertainty, and like in Macbeth's society, there were lots and lots of claimants to the throne. So this idea of people battling for the throne and challenging for the throne is a familiar concept to Shakespeare's audience of 1606, to a Jacobean society. That kingship therefore becomes important. We have a new king in James I, who comes after the long reign of Elizabeth I. Witchcraft is important. James I and his society had a significant belief in the existence and power of the supernatural. And crucially, we have the gunpowder plot of 1605, in which Guy Fawkes and his comrades sought to blow up the Houses of Parliament as an act of treason against James I and his court. And the play therefore acts as a nod to James I and a warning against treason and the excessive ambition that caused that plot. So let's get into the play, and our first introduction to Macbeth comes in Act 1, Scene 2. We get an introduction to the character before we've actually met him. It comes from the sergeant on the battlefield who relates to Duncan Macbeth and Banquo's exploits on the battlefield. Doubtful it stood, he said, as two spent swimmers that do cling together and choke their art, the merciless MacDonald, worthy to be a rebel. For to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him. From the western isles of kerns and gallow-glasses is supplied. And fortune on his damned quarrels, smiling, showed like a rebel's whore, but all's too weak. For brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like valour's minion carved out his passage till he faced the slave, which ne'er shook hands nor bade farewell to him, till he unseamed him from the nave to the chaps, and fixed his head upon our battlements. So we learn a number of things about Macbeth from the sergeant's or the captain's account. We learn that he has courage, first of all, and we'll look at a quotation in a moment that really depicts that. He is definitely loyal to his country. He has patriotic duty, because what Macbeth does is to overcome the rebel, the traitor, MacDonald in the process of serving his king and country. In many ways, therefore, he is the very essence of masculinity. He contains and displays many of those attributes we looked at the start: courage, loyalty, patriotic duty. And because of that, he gets a promotion. And on the back of that, Macbeth has every right to believe that he has a legitimate claim to the throne. Not only is he a cousin to the current King Duncan, but he is also his country's greatest warrior and perhaps its most loyal servant at this point in the play. And so Macbeth is within his rights to expect that he might be a potential successor to Duncan. I'll pick one quotation out of that passage, and the captain or the sergeant describes Macbeth as like Valor's minion who carved out his passage. So Macbeth here is a slave to courage and bravery. He is defined by courage and bravery. That's what gives him his masculine aura. He is loyal to his country, but the word carved here gives it almost a feeling of a work of art, as if Macbeth is the very definition, the very picture of masculinity. And passage suggests he's on a journey, and perhaps this is a journey to greatness, and that greatness may well be the throne of Scotland. Macbeth we first meet then in Act 1, Scene 3, the very next scene, and him and Banquo come across the three witches, and the three witches give Macbeth, they're only interested in speaking to Macbeth, first of all, and they give Macbeth three prophecies. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor. And all hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter. Macbeth is already Glamis. He then becomes Cawdor, so that prophecy comes true. And then their third prophecy is that Macbeth will become king. Banquo's reaction is telling. He says, "Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair?" So we can deduce from Banquo's reaction that Macbeth has reacted with either fear or excitement or a mixture of the two. And Banquo's surprised because for Banquo, what they are saying is not unreasonable, because Macbeth probably has the right to think that one day he will become king. So he shouldn't be surprised. So Macbeth's surprise or his excitement or his fear is the first indication to us of Macbeth's ambition, because he's clearly fearful of the prospect or excited at the prospect of becoming king, which suggests he wants to become king before his turn. But Banquo also has ambition. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are not the only characters in this play with ambition. Banquo also has it. He says to the witches, "If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favours nor your hate." It's essential for Shakespeare that Banquo also has ambition, because he acts as the counterpoint to Macbeth's reaction. Look at what the witches say to Banquo here. They say, "Lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none." What they're saying to Banquo here is that he will never become king, but his children will be king. It's different to the prophecy for Macbeth. They tell Macbeth that he himself will be king. Banquo will not be king, but his children will be. And because of that, they tell Banquo that he'll be lesser than Macbeth, yes, because he won't be king, but he will also be greater than him. He will be not so happy, yet much happier. And the reason Banquo will be greater and happier is because he has the privilege of producing an heir, someone who will go on to become king. And this is our first introduction to the idea of lineage and legacy. One of the most important things for a man in Macbeth's world and in Jacobean society is producing an heir. And as we've seen from the uncertainty surrounding the throne of this time, Jacobean society understands this notion, the importance of producing an heir, particularly for a man. That is one of the fundamental parts of masculinity, and we get the first hint of it here. Banquo's reaction to the witch's prophecies is intriguing. If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favours nor your hate. Banquo definitely has ambition. He asks the witches, if you can predict the future for Macbeth, then can you predict the future for me too? But his reaction is different. Banquo is definitely interested in the potential for growth, as suggested by seeds. He has ambition, but seeds suggest something regenerative, something positive, something to be nurtured. There's nothing dangerous about Banquo's ambition. He's not willing to manipulate fate. He says, I neither beg nor fear your favours. And he doesn't want the witch's hate either. He rejects evil. Banquo's ambition is centred in goodness, in what is right. And that's important because Shakespeare wants to reveal to us that ambition is part of human nature. It's how we handle it that counts. It contrasts greatly to Macbeth's reaction to the witches. He says, stay you imperfect speakers, tell me more, speak I charge you. Well, he certainly recognises their evil intent. He calls them imperfect speakers. He doesn't have a problem with that. He's willing to embrace it. In fact, Macbeth is an imperfect listener. The witches just make predictions about the future. They don't influence him. They don't suggest that they can change fate. In fact, the witches tell us they can't change fate. Macbeth takes fate into his own hands. So Macbeth is an imperfect listener. He has a darker ambition than Banquo. He also uses 4 imperative verbs here: stay, tell, speak and charge. This is a clear indication of Macbeth's ambition. He is desperate to know what his future holds. Banquo asked a question and he says he doesn't beg their favours or their hate. Macbeth is desperate for it. The imperative verbs also reveal to us that Macbeth is trying to exert his masculine dominance here. And there are reasons. We'll look a bit later at the reasons why Macbeth is so desperate to exert his masculine dominance. It comes down to this idea of legacy and lineage. We then start to see Macbeth's ambition in its purest form. His first aside of the play is important. Now, Macbeth's asides, and we have lots of them in the play, asides are when the character on stage is speaking only to the audience. The other characters on stage can't hear him. And he says, 2 truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of imperial theme. And we'll look at that quotation in a bit more detail in a moment. He then starts to talk about the prediction. He says, it cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? I am Thane of Cawdor. The second prediction has come true now. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs? Macbeth's heart is beating here. His seated heart has been sparked into life here. His still heart has been sparked into life, either through fear, but also possibly through excitement. And he recognises that there's something to be done. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical. He's already considering the possibility of treason, of murdering the king. Macbeth's ambition is much darker and more immediate than Banquo's, and that's important for Shakespeare. It's not ambition that's the problem, it's how you handle it. And then Duncan names Malcolm the Prince of Cumberland, and that means Malcolm is next in line to the throne. And Macbeth's response through another aside, so he's revealing his inner thoughts here. The Prince of Cumberland, that is a step on which I must fall down, or else so leap, for in my way it lies. Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires. He's hiding from the judgment of God here in the form of the stars, and he's also asking that God turns away and is hidden from his black and deep desires. And the word black and the word deep are significant here. Black with its connotations of evil in this context, and his deep desires. Macbeth's ambition, his dark ambition, is an inherent part of his character. It lies within his very being. Let's have a look at Macbeth's first aside then. Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. The predictions, the witch's predictions, the first two have come true, are just happy prologues. The prologue comes before the main story. This is just the beginning for Macbeth. There is undeniable ambition here. Swelling suggests growth, like the seeds that Banquo talked about, but very different at the same time. Swelling has connotations of disease. This is a much more sinister ambition than Banquo's was, and he's dreaming of the imperial theme. His focus is on the crown, on becoming king immediately, which surely foreshadows the treason he is eventually to commit. Once again, Shakespeare is keen to contrast Macbeth's reaction to the witch's prophecies to Banquo's, in order that he can make his point about ambition, that the problem is not with ambition itself, but with the way in which you handle ambition. Banquo says to Macbeth that trusted home might yet enkindle you unto the crown besides the Thane of Cawdor. So he acknowledges the possibility that the prophecies are true. He does not deny them. But he says, and oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles, to betray us in deepest consequence. This is a warning to Macbeth from Banquo. Whereas Macbeth recognises the witches as the imperfect speakers, he is still willing to listen to them. Banquo recognises them as instruments of darkness, and for Banquo, that means that they have the potential to do harm. They have the potential to trick him and to trick Macbeth. He recognises their potential for evil. Macbeth embraces their potential for evil, and in embracing their potential for evil, he reveals quite how strong his ambition is. Banquo shows so much more restraint than Macbeth does. He says, "Hold, take my sword." He's talking to his son now, Fleance. There's husbandry in heaven. Their candles are all out. He recognises that the light of heaven is out. The darkness is starting to take over. He sees the potential in Macbeth. "Take thee too, a heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep. Merciful powers, restrain me in the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." He talks directly to the heavens here. He's talking to the angels, the merciful powers, and asking them to restrain him, to prevent him from giving in to ambition. The cursed thoughts are the ambitious thoughts that nature gives way to in repose. Banquo acknowledges, and here is Shakespeare asking us to acknowledge, that ambition is a natural part of human nature, but we have to control it. And this comes on the back, don't forget, of the gunpowder plot against James I, who Shakespeare is writing for. This is his patron. He has to issue this warning against excessive ambition. He has to flag up the dangers of excessive ambition. But also in that self-control, Banquo displays loyalty. This isn't just about ambition, it's about masculinity as well. He displays loyalty to God, and he displays loyalty to the king and his country. And in doing so, he fulfills one of the criteria of masculinity that Macbeth is perhaps not ready to fulfill. So in many ways, Banquo is starting to reveal that he is more of a man than Macbeth. He's more loyal, and he is able to secure himself a legacy that Macbeth is currently unable to do. But then we get this fascinating soliloquy from Macbeth. and he starts to consider the possibility of murdering Duncan if it were done. So the if it were done there, he's starting to acknowledge that this is a possibility. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and end-all. But here upon this bank and shoal of time would jump the life to come. But in these cases we still have judgment here. This is a soliloquy which is full of purpose, but at the same time full of doubt. Macbeth is torn between his ambition and his loyalty, torn between his ambition and his fear of God's judgment. He fears God's judgment. He says that we but teach bloody instructions, which, being taught, return to plague the inventor. Macbeth is afraid of consequence here. He's afraid of consequence, and particularly God's reaction to what he is planning to do, because Macbeth is aware that his ambition is asking him to go against God's natural order, to break the great chain of being. The king is God's representative on earth. By killing the king, he is going against God's wishes, and he fears the consequences of that. He finishes this interesting soliloquy with, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. This is a hunting reference. This is a horse riding reference. Spurs that riders wear on their heels in order to press into the sides of the horse to make them go and to make them go faster. And vaulting ambition is about jumping. So this is a hunting reference. This is again appealing to James I, a fan of hunting. And what he reveals in this metaphor here is the danger of excessive ambition, vaulting ambition which o'erleaps itself and falls, the danger of jumping too high too soon and falling as a result. This is very much about ambition. He fears that his ambition will make him do too much too soon, and he will fall as a result of that. Another warning from Shakespeare about the dangers of excessive ambition. In terms of masculinity, we see Macbeth from both sides here. There is strength in his positivity of thought. There is also doubt, and that might be perceived as a weakness. But his loyalty might also be perceived as masculine strength. And it is his wife who recognises earlier in the play, in Act 1, Scene 5, that Macbeth possesses what she perceives as this weakness in terms of masculinity. She says, as part of her soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 5, she says, "Thou art not without ambition, but without the illness to attend it." She recognises that Macbeth has ambition, but he doesn't have the capability to realise it. And she says in this famous line that he is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Milk, of course, carrying connotations of purity and femininity. So in this line, Lady Macbeth begins the process of emasculating her husband, questioning his masculinity in order to make him do what he knows he must do and what she wants him to do. Let's not forget that Macbeth has written to Lady Macbeth, telling her about the prophecies, and by doing that, he is essentially asking for her support. It is Macbeth's ambition which starts this process, not his wife's. Macbeth shows ambition first, and then Lady Macbeth's support for her husband and her ambition takes over. But she knows that her husband lacks what she sees as the masculine quality to get this done. She questions his masculine strength. And we see Lady Macbeth again questioning this masculine strength in Act 1, Scene 7, in this wonderful exchange between the two. Macbeth says, "We will proceed no further in this business. We'll have no more of this. It ends here." And what Lady Macbeth does is to question then Macbeth's masculinity. She is acutely aware of the importance to Macbeth of looking like a man, of being the archetypal man. It's important for Macbeth to look like the archetypal man if he is ever to become king. So what she does then is start to question how much of a man he is, to emasculate him. Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself, she says to him. Are these clothes of masculinity that you are wearing just a facade? Is it just a pretense? Macbeth responds though. He doesn't give in to this emasculation immediately. I dare do all that may become a man, he says. I am everything that a man should be. And she questions him again. What beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me? When you durst do it, then you were a man. There's the challenge to his masculinity. But Macbeth still, we can presume, Lady Macbeth continues here, so we can presume that Macbeth is not backing down. So then she goes to this tale here. I have given suck and know how tender it is to love the babe that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out. Not only does Lady Macbeth reveal her own ambition here, look at the lengths she would go to. She would sink to the lowest possible means in order to realise the ambition of this couple. She would kill her own baby. But what she also does is reveal that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth once had a child which has obviously died. It might have died as an infant. And it is that spurs Macbeth into action, because Macbeth then responds, bring forth men children only. So to Macbeth, he doesn't respond to having his masculinity questioned until the idea of legacy and lineage comes up. As soon as Lady Macbeth questions Macbeth's potential to have a child, that is when he turns. Bring forth men children only, and he wants a boy. He knows how important it is for him to produce a male heir in order to carry on his family line. That is what changes. I think throughout this play, the most important aspect of masculinity for Macbeth is the idea of lineage and heritage and legacy. And as soon as Lady Macbeth questions that, that is when he responds. That is when he feels less of a man. And that is what spurs him to commit the crime. And we know in between Act 2, Scene 1 and Act 2, Scene 2, he commits the murder of Duncan. And it's the aftermath of that murder that we get in Act 2, Scene 2, and it's a fascinating aftermath. Macbeth's reaction is fascinating, and even more so when contrasted with his wife. Macbeth comes onto the stage, and he's rambling away. He's covered in blood. Amen stuck in my throat, he says. Macbeth hath murdered sleep. Amen stuck in my throat, first of all, because Macbeth knows that his ambition has caused him to go against God's wishes, to go against the natural order. That's why he can't say amen. He knows he is susceptible to God's judgment. Then he says, Macbeth hath murdered sleep. Well, sleep here. Sleep is our way of regenerating ourselves, our way of returning to our natural being. And by Macbeth saying he's murdered sleep, he recognises that because of his ambition, he will never be the same again. And neither will Scotland. He hasn't just murdered his own sleep, he's murdered the sleep of his own country. Scotland will never be returned to what it was as a result of what he's done. And he pleads to Neptune, the god of the sea, in order to cleanse him of this guilt. Blood in this play is always a symbol of guilt. And here Macbeth is covered not just in literal blood, but the guilt of what he has done. And he pleads for the god of the oceans to cleanse him of this guilt, a baptism of sorts, if you like. But he knows that he will never be clean of this crime. His excess ambition has caused him to commit a crime from which he will never actually recover in terms of guilt and remorse. Lady Macbeth's response is fascinating. Macbeth is laden with guilt. Lady Macbeth appears to feel nothing of this guilt. She says infirm of purpose. She questions his masculinity again and again when she says, my hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white. White here associated with cowardice. She recognises she's got blood on her hands, but she doesn't feel the same guilt as Macbeth. And in contrast to Macbeth's plea to Neptune, she says, a little water clears us of this deed. So we see a subversion here of the gender stereotype, and Lady Macbeth takes on the masculine role, the strong masculine role, and Macbeth is very much in need of her assistance and her support. But Macbeth is crowned. Macbeth gets what the witches predicted and gets what in some way he feels he deserves. Malcolm and Donalbain, Duncan's two sons, are afraid that they are going to be blamed for the crime and they flee to England and Ireland. And so Macbeth is the next successor to the throne. He is the rightful person to take this throne, it seems. So Macbeth, you would think, has got what he wanted, but he is not a happy king. He is not a content king, because he knows, first of all, that he disrupted God's order in doing the crime and rising to the throne, but also that he cannot produce an heir, or it seems he cannot produce an heir, and that is what makes him feel less of a king and less of a man. He starts this wonderful soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 1 with, to be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. He is a paranoid king, and what he fears is Banquo. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. Banquo's royalty of nature, he knows that Banquo is more of a man than him because he's produced an heir, and also he is more of a king than him. He possesses the qualities of masculinity and kingship that Macbeth lacks, and that is why Macbeth fears him. And then later on, we see again Macbeth's obsession with this idea of lineage. They hailed him father to a line of kings. He returns to the witches' prophecies here. The witches prophesied that Banquo would give birth to kings. He wouldn't become a king himself. And that's what Macbeth so desperately wants in order to make him feel like a man. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren sceptre in my gripe. Thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. For Banquo's issue have I filed my mind, and then to make them kings the seed of Banquo kings. And this is a fascinating section for Macbeth. We see him talk about a fruitless crown and a barren sceptre, and he also talks about Banquo's issue and Banquo's seed, where he's talking about symbols of fertility. Fruitless and barren are both in the semantic field of infertility. That is what Macbeth is so terrified about, that he can't produce an heir to carry on his line. He talks about the unlineal hand, this obsession with lineage. The futility of excessive ambition is due to the fact that he feels emasculated because he can't produce a son. So once again, we see how that idea of lineage is the most important element of masculinity to Macbeth. It is that that makes him feel emasculated. When we get to the banquet scene, Act 3, Scene 4, we see Banquo's ghost return to haunt Macbeth as a reminder of his guilt and of the effects of excessive ambition. But he's also a reminder to Macbeth about his inadequacy as a man. let's not forget that Banquo is the man with legacy and lineage. He is the man who is loyal to God and the king and the country. He embodies all of the qualities of masculinity, some of which Macbeth lacks. And so he appears to Macbeth, and Macbeth says, "What man dare I dare? Approach thou like the rugged Russian bear, the armed rhinoceros, or the Hykran tiger. Take any shape but that, and my firm nerves shall never tremble. Or be alive again, and dare me to the desert with thy sword. If trembling I inhabit, then protest me, the baby of a girl, hence horrible shadow." Here we see Macbeth trying to exert his masculinity over Banquo. He challenges Banquo to look like the Russian bear or the armed rhinoceros, the strongest representations of physical strength and dominance in the natural world. And he says he's happy to take them on. However, he's not happy to face up to Banquo in his current form, because Banquo is a reminder of his own inadequacies. So he's happy to take on these strong animals, but he's not happy to confront, he's not willing to confront what Banquo represents. So in trying to exert his own masculinity, Macbeth in many ways only undermines that masculinity. It's noticeable that Macbeth also tries to exert his manliness in the form of conflict, in the form of battle, because that is the aspect of masculinity that Macbeth understands. That is the bit of masculinity that Macbeth possesses and will never lose. And so Banquo becomes the horrible shadow for Macbeth, a very powerful metaphor to describe the way in which Banquo will follow Macbeth as a reminder of what he's done, as a reminder of his guilt, but also as a reminder of his inadequacies as a man. And we can see that quite clearly when Banquo disappears again, because Macbeth says, "Why so, being gone, I am a man again." Because with Banquo not there, Macbeth can ignore those inadequacies and return to the man who is the warrior and strong on the battlefield. But Macbeth nevertheless has relentless ambition. He will not let it go. He says at the end of this scene, Act 3, Scene 4, he says, "I am bent to know by the worst means," the worst. His ambition, it didn't seem possible, but it has taken on an even darker note. It has intensified at this point. He says, "I am in blood stepped in so far, that should I wade no more, returning was as tedious as go over. Strange things I have in head that will to hand, which must be acted ere they may be scanned." He says, first of all, I am in blood stepped in so far. I've gone so far through this purpose now. It's as far to go back as it is to finish it off. So I might as well continue. His ambition now knows no bounds. And he also says, "Strange things I have in head, that will to hand." This has changed. This is the man who earlier said, "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent." He now says, "Everything I have in my head, I will do. Things I have in head that will to hand, which must be acted ere they be scanned." He fears people judging him now. If he doesn't go through with it, he might seem less of a man, less of a king. So he needs to go through with these things now in order to prove himself. And of course, he goes on to visit the witches again, and they warn him about Macduff. And so he goes and kills Macduff's family, his wife and his children. Again, this seems to me to be that absolute fear of not producing an heir. Macduff, like Banquo, has produced a son who will carry on his family line. And like killing Banquo, he tried to kill Fleance as well. He then goes and kills Banquo's wife and son. So that he goes on to kill Macduff's wife and son. So that Macduff can no longer have children either. Macbeth is obsessed with this idea of lineage and heritage. And we see that again when he goes to visit the witches. Their final vision, apparition, is the one of the line of kings. He produces they produce a line of 8 kings, the last with a glass in his hand, a mirror, and the ghost of Banquo following. The mirror is important because it makes it look as if the line of kings goes into infinity. Here's another crucial reminder to Macbeth that he will not be able to produce an heir. His family will not be able to join this line of kings. And look how he responds. The crown does sear mine eyeballs. What will the line stretch out to the crack of doom? It's that reminder of his inability to produce an heir that reminds him he is not enough of a man and that he is not the rightful king. And that throws Macbeth into this fit of doubt. So he exerts himself as a man in the only way that he knows how, and that is as the warrior. Macbeth is forever the warrior. Bring me no reports, let them fly all, till Birnam wood remove to Dunsinane I cannot taint with fear. He takes the witches' prophecies and he turns them so that they suit his purposes, so that he thinks he's invincible. They tell him that Birnam wood, he'll never die until Birnam wood comes to Dunsinane. They also tell him that no man of woman born shall harm Macbeth. And Macbeth assumes, therefore, that nobody can kill him. He's invincible. Again, he is the imperfect listener. He takes the witches' prophecies and he turns them into what he wants to hear in order that he can realise his ambition. His ambition knows no bounds. But again, just at the point where Macbeth seems certain to carry through on his ambition, there comes a moment of doubt. And what causes that moment of doubt is Lady Macbeth's death. He hears of Lady Macbeth dying. She's taken her own life. She's been consumed by the guilt of what they've done, and she takes her own life in Act 5, Scene 1. And somebody comes and tells Macbeth, and he delivers this absolutely magnificent soliloquy. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So for Macbeth, this is the final nail in the coffin. Lady Macbeth's death confirms that forever that he will never produce an heir. And that is why at this point life seems so futile to him. Look at the words in the semantic field of time here. He recognises the futility of time now and the futility of life because he cannot produce an heir. He will never fulfil the expectations of masculinity. But he continues until his final moment when Macduff confronts him and Macduff ends up killing him. And Macduff cuts off Macbeth's head and he makes Macbeth an example, just as Macbeth made Macdonald an example at the start of the play for being a traitor. Macduff makes Macbeth an example as a traitor. This is the final warning against excessive ambition. Macbeth will be a warning, an example forevermore against the dangers of ambition. And this comes on the back of the Gunpowder Plot. This is very much a play of its time and a play for King James.